I entitled this next chapter Cognitio Dei, and that means the seeing of God, the realizing of God. And with that, I allude to Moses' encounter with God. And around this scene revolves my fourth part. And I come here to the crucial question of why Mars had abandoned his plan to commission Stella. To give up this plan had enormous consequences for his life, as you will see. When Mars is torn between Stella and Amy, that is between the dark aspect of the anima and the light aspect of the anima, at the climax of this acute conflict, there occurs the unheard of event, something that figuratively crosses his life's path and thwarts the hero, ruining his best laid plans. Remember, Moss describes with painstaking accuracy how he arranges to have Stella eliminated by a contract killing. And he is retelling this, I don't know, I think it goes over 3 or 4 pages long. In this context of telling this, how he would like to have her commissioned, he mentions a ghastly dream that came to him the night before the money was to be handed over. In this dream, he found himself in the basement of a mobster. The dreamer was required to cut his finger and let the blood drip down the mobster's throat. Consequently, Moss would be in league with organized crime. He is about to become one of them, a mobster too. The dream depicts the activation of destructive forces in the unconscious, embodied in the mobster, and confronts the dreamer with the evil in his own psyche. Faust and his alliance with the devil, with Mephistopheles, comes naturally to mind here. The warning dream can be interpreted as foreshadowing the appearance of the dark god the following day. Mars provides the context for that all-changing break, which is to occur the moment he will actually hand over the money, thus giving the okay for the killer to carry out the job. So Moss gives the context. This is a quote from the book. Moss speaking, quote, "I pass a bank and see my reflection in the plate glass window, rushing toward my destination, my hand in my pants pockets, Sinatra style. And I realized, completely insane. The large glass pane provided just enough of a reflection. The light was right for me to catch a glimpse of myself. And I stopped dead, looked at myself in that sea of glass, saw my eyes, the eyes of a stranger looking back at me. I was so unrecognizable that it horrified me. I turned away just a half turn to the door, took one step, then another, went into the bank, made my way to the teller, and deposited the money. Unquote. In this moment of reflection, that is, in this moment of his image being reflected by the mirroring glass of the bank building surface, Marx shockingly recognizes the presence of the strange, dark God within himself. Those are his own eyes from which the demon looks at him. The biblical image of the, quote, sea of glass, an image from Revelations 4-6, the biblical image of the sea of glass of the bank building's outer surface creates a connection to the God of the apocalypse, who, according to legend, reflected his face in the ocean of heaven that surrounded his throne, the sea of glass. This epiphany is so overwhelming and terrifying that Marx instinctively revises his plan without thinking. We know that mirroring surfaces, have served as means of self-knowledge since time immemorial. In early cultures, they were the smooth surface of a body of water. Mirrors and windows represent thresholds into the unconscious, making the unseen visible. The uncanny face in the mirror represents the primordial, undifferentiated dark aspect of the psyche that has been teased out by Marx's murderous behavior. And as it happens, yes, Marx is at odds with himself because of the deep conflict with Stella. He acts contrary to instinct and is obsessed with power. He wants to have his child back. And he does everything to get this. The murderousness that has befallen him is, in a sense, reflected back at him. And that means he has to see and accept the killer, this killer shadow within himself. If Marx were to give in to the constellated instinct for revengeful destruction, he would be completely assimilated or swallowed, swept away by overpowering violence. He would be a mere tool of Satan. An archetype of such an encounter with the dark other is found in the New Testament. I mean, the temptation of Jesus by a power devil in Matthew 4:1-11. Jesus stays in the desert for 40 days. In this phase of introversion, he becomes certain that his kingdom is not of this world. Marx, too, does not allow himself to be used by the tempter and makes an ethical decision that includes a felt knowledge of the right way. In the immediate confrontation with the antagonist, with the devil, Jesus recognized that time is fulfilled. The kingdom of heaven is present. He speaks to the people, return and repent, and your sins are forgiven. Because Jesus has recognized the way, he sees the inner kingdom already given as reality. Because Jesus has experienced it and now acts accordingly. He heals the sick and proclaims the gospel. Moss also chooses the inner way. He lives alone for 40 years from now on and writes an extensive manuscript that will be lost to him many years later. This writing is something like his personal confession of sins, insofar as he confesses the conspiracy with the mafia therein. In his conversation with the narrator, Moss picks up where he left off, bringing his diabolical drive and lust for power to life once again. And this is, I think, this is typical shadow work, the work on his shadow, although maybe not consciously. This shadow work is a condition for the recovery of the anima. But again, back to that numinous moment of God's appearance in the bank's mirroring outer glass surface. Psychologically, the ego stopping that moment of standing still means Moss is ready to accept the dark God who assaults him through the mirror. It is an involuntary pausing and realization of God's darkly numinous presence, a moment of supreme danger. Moss consciously renounces and moves away from the grand plan, a step which results in enormous consequences for his life. Such a radical turn of events is synonymous with a metanoia. Metanoia, you know this Greek word. I mean with this, a complete reversal in the sense of reorientation and new direction. But how would this reversal, which turns the persecutor, that Moss is, into the persecuted, how would this reversal be understood as an inner process? At first, the ego takes a masculine attitude toward the conflict with Stella, with the anima. Moss allows himself to be driven by instinct for aggression and power. He asserts his claim on the daughter, and any means will do, even if it be the murder of his own wife. This is the phallic nature, penetrative thrust, directed energy. Then, triggered by the vision, and enantiodromia. Enantiodromia is a word Jung uses a lot in his answer to Job, for example, and it means a sudden switch to the opposite. And this has happened here in this vision. There occurs a sudden switch to the opposite. Now, after the first phase of the masculine attitude, Moss took towards the conflict, now triggered through the vision, now occurs the second phase, a female understanding prevails. Moss becoming, you could say, a receiving vessel. He pauses, reflects, and understands what his eyes have received, what has penetrated him to the core. He accepts this content and makes the spontaneous, ethical decision to step back, to withdraw. But what did he realize in that moment of revelation, of seeing this dark face in the mirror, which is his own dark eyes and his own drive to kill? What did he realize in that moment of revelation? Moss himself uses the image of the, quote, vessel of anger, which that demonic being in the mirror had been ready to pour out on him. The biblical cup of wrath, again, a quote from Revelations, it's Revelation 16, 1-21. The biblical cup of wrath symbolizes the onslaught of archetypal destructive energies lurking behind the dark eyes in the mirror. When these elemental forces are released, they bring sevenfold calamity upon the earth. I think I repeat that sentence, it's so important. The biblical cup of wrath symbolizes the onslaught of archetypal destructive energies lurking behind the dark eyes in the mirror. When these elemental forces are released, they bring, quote, sevenfold calamity upon the earth. This is Revelation 15:7. Sevenfold calamity. The archetypal image of the cup of wrath makes visible the larger collective canvas behind the individual experience of Moss. For example, we have such an archetypal image of the dark god in Jeremiah, where it says, quote from Jeremiah, Yahweh, the God of Israel, said this to me, take this cup of wine from my hand to make all the nations to whom I sent you drink it. Let them drink and reel, lose their wits at the sword I am sending among them. I took the cup from the hand of Yahweh and made all the nations to whom Yahweh sent me drink it. This is Jeremiah 25:15-18. Edinger interprets this passage thus, quote, we must realize that affects and concupiscence derive from Yahweh, because it's the effect of his divine wrath that is being poured out. Affects and concupiscence are the manifestations of the primitive, unregenerate self. So that to assimilate those affects and to subjugate that concupiscence means, in essence, to drink the contents of the cup of divine wrath rather than pour it out. And to do so, and to do that, brings about a transformation or humanization of the self, unquote. This divine power, the affect power that comes from the self, approaches Moss, and it wants to realize itself through him, through Moss, to use him as an implementing organ. He would be, metaphorically speaking, the filled cup of wrath that is about to be poured out. Now, Yahweh paradoxically lets the cup of wrath be poured out over Babylon after he had used Babylon shortly before as a punishing tool against his people. And this very scenario also threatens Moss. After God would have used Moss to destroy Stella, he would pour out the cup of wrath on him, on Moss. We learn, after all, that Moss, like the other mobsters, would have died in a bloodbath had he arrived on time at the agreed meeting place. And so the appearance in the mirror was also a fateful, life-saving event, as Moss explains to the narrator. Moss speaking, quote, if the light striking the bank's window, if that cloud in the sky had passed over the sun, just imagine what a crazy thought. If the wind driving the cloud had been a bit stronger and the sun had been hidden a moment sooner, I wouldn't have stopped, wouldn't have seen anything in the window, or at least not enough to stop me in my tracks, unquote. Moss, at any rate, immediately recognizes that the onslaught of instinct is meant for him, since he has betrayed his beloved. Out of vindictiveness and greed, he wants Stella killed in order to gain possession of the child. Is this wrathful face now to be understood as a threat of punishment? Or is it the dark God in his primitive aspect who does not at all want to act morally and punish, but who simply recognizes a vessel into which he can pour out his cup of wrath? Or is it both, a moral God and at the same time an undifferentiated demonic God? Despite all ambivalence, it is also clear that Moss is meant to see the face. He recognizes this after he has distanced himself, returns again to the spot where he had stood still, mirrored, and now finds everything changed. Moss speaking, quote, the sun was at a different angle now, or maybe a cloud was blocking it. At any rate, nothing caught my attention this time. I had glanced at the bank window because I wanted to see again what I had recognized. But as I said, the window was no longer reflecting. The light had changed, unquote. It was ultimately the sun that was positioned so favorably that it allowed him for a moment to see the outrageous danger he was in. Moss understood this twist of fate as a hint. Had he continued on his way, he would have perished in the hail of bullets in the diner along with the others. The fact that Moss resists the diabolical temptation to be seduced into power is a moral achievement that is anything but self-evident. Because he does not identify himself and decides of his own free will against the offer, he makes himself the vessel of the dark god who wants to change. He, Moss, is an example for an earthly tabernacle. Earthly tabernacle, as Jung once pointed out in a letter to Robert Corti. Moss himself describes his refusal of the dark aspect of God as a pact with God, insofar as he, Moss, was spared from ruin at the price of the daughter. Again, Moss speaking, quote, I was making this sacrifice because, well, in the last analysis of my own free will, I had seen something. Crazy, that reflection. Put there to let him, God, see the truth. He was the crazy one. I think he, God, saw himself in me. At this moment, saw himself in my plans and was prepared to empty out his vessel of anger. Unquote. Marie-Louise von Franz pointed out on several occasions that we cannot integrate such powerful affects as anger, hatred, or envy into our ordinary ego. Quote, von Franz, all that hopeful, well-meaning prattle we hear about integrating one's own aggression is nonsense. Only through effort and suffering can we lend support to the integration of these powers into the self. In other words, we can only integrate our personal shadow, not the collective shadow of the self, the dark side of the Godhead. Unquote. Moss is required to make a nearly inhuman sacrifice in this regard. He is required to make a nearly inhuman sacrifice. Not only must he give up his ideas of a happy family life, he must forgo one of the deepest human instincts, the paternal feeling toward his own child. Psychologically, the sacrifice of his daughter signifies an overcoming of the unconscious, insofar as the forced detachment from her, from the daughter, is a condition of the possibility of redeeming the anima. I think I should repeat this because it's important and complicated. Psychologically, the sacrifice of his daughter signifies an overcoming of the unconscious insofar as the forced detachment from her, from Amy, is a condition of the possibility of redeeming the anima. Parallel to this, the still sun-like attitude with its sun, I mean S-O-N. So as a parallel to this, the still sun-like attitude with its unconscious attachment to the mother is abandoned. As a result of his renunciation, Moss enters into a gruesome process of both being split and paralyzed at the same time. This condition of being split and paralyzed extends over many years and wears him down. He is without anima, without life energy. Yet, after 40 years of this wandering in the desert, the path of suffering culminates in that final moment of fulfillment, which the text captures in the enigmatic phrase, quote, "and Mars glowed in the light of his visitation," unquote. This is the last sentence of the story, as you may remember. Mars glowed in the light of his visitation. Mars, when he has finished telling his story, has arrived at himself. He is one with himself and in touch with his soul center. He had, quote, this is the narrator, Mars had collected his life around him and said, "You are both here, nothing is missing," unquote. Stella and Amy are gathered again and stand before him, before Mars, recollected. The outward sign of this rediscovered wholeness is the fire that lights Mars up inside and makes his face shine like the face of Moses after his coming down from the mountain, from Mount Sinai, after the encounter with God and the revelation of the law. This is Exodus 34:29. It is the fire of life that is rekindled with all its warmth and vitality, and at the same time with its luminous glow. At the end of his journey, Mars is reconnected to the anima, to Eros, as the thread of feeling. So, how can we understand the archetypal background of this story set entirely in contemporary Californian everyday life? We have already encountered some mythical figures like Cory, Persephone in The Prodigal Daughter, and Pegasus as the offspring and overcomer of the negative mother at the beginning of the narrative, or the desert experience of Jesus and his temptation by Satan. There is another mythic subtext that runs throughout the solar eclipse story. And this is the Exodus narrative of the Old Testament. You may have realized this already. In this context, the protagonist, Moss McCloud, functions as a, you can say, modern version of the biblical Moses figure. Like the legendary hero who led his people out of Egyptian slavery into the promised land, Moss is charged with leading the enslaved anima out of the unconscious. In other words, the liberator qualities of the archetypal Moses figure are also inherent in Moss, as his very name, a shortened form of Moses, signals. The original Moses ability, that divine liberator and redeemer power, is rudimentarily present in Moss and can be activated accordingly. Patrick Roth's Moss, however, is not an archetype in the sense of a classical hero. Rather, the archetype is represented in Mos. In him, there is an oppression or enslavement at work, a subjugation of the soul herself. As with so many men and women in our time, the feminine principle is in captivity. And like the people of Israel, it must be freed so psychic balance can be restored. In other words, the conscious mind must connect with the unconscious in order for man to recover and be restored to health. Like the legendary predecessor, Mos also embarks on a 40-year wandering through the desert, the wilderness, before reaching the Holy Land at the end of the journey. As Moses follows God in the desert, that is, as he follows the cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night, so too Mos seeks to follow his personal star of destiny. Mos is a modern son of a cloud, a Mech cloud, and he is as such a God seeker who, as we have seen, allows himself to be seized by the numinosum and is able to acknowledge even a negative, persecuting aspect of God. This applies equally to Moses and Mos. The way is the goal, because it is not granted to them to arrive concretely in the promised land. Moses dies shortly before the Israelites enter Canaan, and Mos is not reunited with his wife and daughter at the end of the story. The redemption of their longing eludes them, eludes both Mos and Moses. And yet, a transformation has taken place along the way. The people of Israel who enter the Holy Land are no longer the people who once went out of Egypt. And Mos too is no longer who he was before telling his story. He has rediscovered his emotional life and experiences the anima as an inner vision of the feminine that makes him, the deprived, divided one, whole again, and infuses him with life. And yet, the ending of the story is enigmatic and is also contradictory. Couldn't the mysterious glow, that allusion to Moses' shining face after receiving the law, also indicate an inflation? Might not Mos in the end be identified with the self, with God? And isn't there something psychotic about his attitude, his last words to Amy, addressed to the narrator, as if this, his listener, were Amy herself? Certainly, Mos has recreated his loves. They are undoubtedly an inner reality to him. But they are imaginings without counterpart in the external world, in which, after all, Mos still lives as a flesh and blood human being. This problem of a one-sided spiritualization is also found in some fairy tales, as Marie-Louise von Franz has shown us. The transformation does not come to earth, not down to the experiential world. It remains in the spiritual sphere. Because the experience remains in the imagination, but nothing has changed in practical everyday life, the danger of a relapse and a new fall is great. As soon as Mars becomes completely sane again, he will realize he is alone. And yet, if we look back at the beginning of the story, it is evident he has created something lasting. He now knows that he has loved, and in doing so, he has known, has recognized the anima. So how would Moss's experience be evaluated in terms of his individuation? And here is my answer, the attempt of an answer. One might say, for a man like Moss, who is suffering from a negative mother complex, it is crucial that he learns to separate, to differentiate himself. Since such a man is obsessed with the anima, life at a certain point tragically intervenes and creates facts that force a detachment, a separation. For example, suddenly and unexpectedly, the wife runs away. This creates space for a new awareness. Now, being alone, this man has a chance to differentiate and experience the anima as an objective inner reality or inner quality that is autonomous and not simply a part of him. Moss has had to suffer this painful lesson in a 40-year involuntarily individuation, a 40-year involuntary individuation. As we know, the number 40 often indicates the number of transformation, as in Jesus' desert experience or in the process of mummification, of eternalizing the body with the Egyptians. But then, after these 40 years of wandering in the desert, something unforeseen happens. A turning point occurs. Moss finds a companion who takes part in his fate, who listens to him patiently. And now comes the decisive moment. Through the remembering by telling, life storytelling, and by way of collecting and piece by piece confessing the fragments of the stellar experience, Moss creates for himself a situation that allows him to regain his lost connection to the anima. One may say the first, rather unconscious phase of individuation within these 40 years is crowned and completed by a new consciousness gained during a second, a more condensed phase, via that long conversation with the narrator. The anima, which Moss sees mysteriously before him at the very end, remains projected, to be sure. but something is mysteriously redeemed in the course of his narration. For Moss now realizes that it need not be he who makes connection with the anima, that this might also be done for him by his friend, the narrator. Quote, Moss is speaking. Listen, Amy. Moss was speaking directly to me, the narrator. If anyone tells you this story, maybe it will be my friend here who went looking for my manuscript with me, the manuscript I wrote for you. Moss stared at me, his eyes never wavering from my face. But we didn't find it, Amy, not a trace. This friend of mine will tell you the story when I'm dead and gone. He'll tell you what had happened when I took your mother's hand. And I loved that woman, Amy. I loved her. He'll describe it for you. Unquote. At the end of the story, the helpful function of the narrator, as therapeutic as it is poetic, the helpful function of the narrator once again comes into focus. The narrator is commissioned by Moss to bear witness of his life story and to pass it on to his daughter and to all those who follow. The narrator thus moves into the position of a mediator and a remembrancer who, when Moss will no longer exist, will pass on the life essence of this man. Inasmuch as Moss commissions the narrator to bear witness to his experience with the feminine, he has become aware that his life was not in vain. He knows something will remain and be passed on to the next generation, something that must not be forgotten. This legacy of Moss is reminiscent of the legacy of the biblical Moses, who, before crossing into the promised land, leaves the Israelites the Song of Moses. And you find that in Deuteronomy 32, 1-49. So again, before crossing into the promised land, Moses leaves the Israelites the Song of Moses to serve as a future witness to the people before God. Moss, on the other hand, leaves behind the testimony of a man bound in love to the anima. He has learned that in order to find the anima, one must lose it. At the end of his search, at the end of his journey, Moss gives up the concrete connection to the wife and daughter. He puts it in the hands of the narrator. It is as if he were saying, I probably won't see Amy again, but you will. This is the assignment to preserve the connection to the anima, and thus to the unconscious. Moss himself certainly does not know what the anima is, but the narrator does, who then follows this story, Solar Eclipse, with two other anima narratives. I'm coming to the end now. Just as a note that might be enlightening in this context. Jung once commented on a highly complex, mysterious, and deep dream that was dreamt by an ordinary simple man. And Jung wondered to himself, now, why would the unconscious send such a dream to a man like this? There is no way he can understand what it means. He won't even listen. He is unable to listen. And then Jung realized, but I was listening. I did indeed hear what the unconscious had to say to him, and thus committed to me who was listening. Sometimes the dreams of others who are unable to understand them may very well be meant for us who have eyes to hear, ears to hear, and eyes to see. And likewise, for those of us who are reading and understanding solar eclipse, Marx's mission has already been accomplished. The narrator, or rather the author behind him, has taken this man's life testimony and extracted the sacred scripture hidden within it for posterity and all who know how to read it. So that's it. That's all I have to say. Thank you.